Welcome to the Book Bungalow's virtual panel event, a Southern Utah retrospective featuring Kathleen Broeder and Dianne Aldrich, authors of the photographic history, Images of America, St. George, published recently through Arcadia Publishing, and Loren R. Webb, author of Southern Utah Memories, a compilation of over 80 personal accounts of people who lived in this area reaching back generations. My name is Tanya Mills, and I'm the owner and manager of the Book Bungalow in St. George, Utah, Southern Utah's only independent bookstore that offers all new books and a full range of events, or at least we try to. While we're open and taking precautions, we're still doing our events virtually. Let me admit some more. But over the summer, we plan to offer a few live events outdoors, and hopefully by fall, we'll be able to safely bring some events indoors again, depending on how everyone is doing. Images of America, St. George, was made possible by a number of people, but particularly the author's access to the special collections and archives in Dixie State University's library. In a moment, Kathleen and Dianne are going to share several of the old photos, I think, featured in their book that bring back what this town was like, or what this area was like when it was smaller, less crowded, and more rural. We have copies for sale in our store, but they're going fast. And I had a woman come in today who wants 14 copies, possibly for her book club. She's probably already been in touch with you. We still have about 10 copies in the store. And I'm out of, this is the last one I have of Loren's, but he's going to bring more tomorrow when they do their signings. And I encourage you all to come and get a copy if you haven't already, and then have the authors sign. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. Kathleen and Dianne, I don't know if you're going to do both 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock, or if you just want to do one, if you're both going to be together. You let us know. In case we run out, you can also order it through our website, and I will include the order link in my follow-up email after the event. Kathleen Broeder heads up Dixie State University's Special Collections and Archives Library. She has served there since 2016 and also teaches an introductory history class. She received 2 master's degrees from the University at Albany SUNY in information science and history. Her professional interests are in the interplay between local history, primary sources, and archival organizational structures to create new opportunities to share and disseminate one-of-a-kind materials with the community at large. Dianne Aldrich received a Master of Science degree in Library and Information Science from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and is currently the head of public services at the Dixie State University Library. Her professional interests focus on higher education, information literacy, diversity and inclusion in higher education, and support services for neurodiverse students. She's also a doctoral student working toward a PhD in leadership in higher education, emphasizing diversity and inclusion. And I'm pretty familiar with her because she serves as secretary of the Red Rock Center for Independence, our RCI board, which my daughter works there at present. She won't much longer, but and the governor appointed her to serve on the Utah State Library Board in 2020. She resides here in beautiful Southern Utah with her husband. I imagine Kathleen does too. Our third author, Loren R. Webb, is a local educator, author, and journalist, and a native of St. George who grew up working on his father's dairy farm. He graduated from Dixie College in 1977 with an associate degree and received his bachelor's degree in journalism and history in 1979 from BYU. I wonder if I met you there. I graduated almost the same time in communications. Anyway, Returning in 1981 to receive his master's degree in communications, an active member of the Washington County Historical Society, Loren's 21 years of news reporting about Southern Utah, people, places, and events make him a valuable resource for the area's rich history. In fact, he took their book when he came in the day that I kind of put this together and thought we ought to do this. And he was commenting on all these different pictures and saying, oh, you see that picture there? And he was telling me about all of these places and how he was familiar with them. And when he put all of that experience into play when he compiled Southern Utah Memories, a collection of personal accounts and stories, some of which he's been accumulating for years. We have copies of his book that have already sold in the bookstore. There'll be more tomorrow morning when he'll be signing on our front porch at 10 a.m. From 10 to 11, right after we open for Independent Bookstore Day. I hope you will all visit. The first 50 customers get a cupcake, along with their, I have 10 copies, 5 of which are signed by Stephen King of a new short story that's never been read before. And in fact, I had a guy from California call me up to see if he could get a copy. I said, only if you call me tomorrow and order it over the phone. So you need to come if you want to get first dibs on things. I will include a link to Loren's website in my follow-up email, but I encourage you to support us by purchasing his book through us if you can. I want to turn the time and the screen over to Kathleen now. I need to admit one more person. She and Dianne are going to show and talk about some of the rare photos they came across and decided to include in their book. So please, both of you go ahead. And Loren, feel free to make comments if any of these pictures stir up memories. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you and for welcoming us on Independent Bookstore Day. We're happy to celebrate that. Libraries and bookstores kind of go hand in hand. So we're very happy to be here today. My name is Kathleen Broeder, like Tanya introduced. Dianne?
And I'm Dianne Aldrich, Head of Public Services, and I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to co-author this book with Kathleen.
Okay, so just want to make sure, are you seeing my slides?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So this is our book. It's Images of America series. That's on St. George itself. So that's the cover, if you now know what to look for if you want to actually purchase from Tanya later on. So we wanted to start our book by looking at the early people who came to this area. And so as we were kind of thinking about this, I mean, this is a photo book, but I didn't want to be quite limited by just photos. We wanted to look at all the images. And so I was thinking, who's the first person that would have made some kind of image of it? And the first one I could think of, at least, was the Dominguez and Escalante expedition in 1776. So they come through Southwest Utah about the same time. Actually, it's a couple months after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. So it's pretty close. But if you notice on the map here, it's down in the bottom corner where you'd kind of expect Southern Utah to be, but they actually have a couple of markings that we can place today. So the Rio Sulfurio is the Virgin River. And they named it that because there's hot springs out by La Virgen, and that's where they crossed it, and it smelled like sulfur. So there you go, right? And then the other river that we know we can place is they call the Rio De Pena Pillar, and this is the Ash Creek. It runs along I-15, along Pintura, and it kind of wanders off over through Tuckerville. So they come across it just as these two rivers converge, okay? And that's kind of where they actually stop, and they have this quote, which I thought is very evocative of the imagery and the landscape of Southern Utah. And so we didn't necessarily get a lot of the language through their own words, but I really like how they talk about the red hills or the sagebrush and the red sand and the outcroppings and the bluffs and stuff. I thought it was so St. George, but they actually don't quite make it to St. George. They go through La Virgen, they head a little bit west into Hurricane. So they just miss us, but I thought it was close enough. And I'm like, you know what? we're counting it. For 1776, this is pretty good. And this is also the only image that we actually got from another library out of the entire book. So everything else is coming from special collections and archives here at DSU. Okay, so our next image is again kind of the early people. And when we were looking at this, we wanted to include people that you may not normally expect to show up in early photographs. So we tried to make sure we included a lot of women. We even have some children. And in this case, we actually have some Native Americans. This is actually Jim Monich and Simon Loeb. They're sitting next to the St. George tithing office. And it's actually the corn crib, because back in the day, they had, everybody brought in gifts in kind. They brought in corn and beef and peaches, whatever they had grown, because money was fairly scarce in St. George. And so they had this tradition of opening up the bishop's storehouse and the tithing office to Native Americans around Thanksgiving and early Christmas. And they would come and partake of some of the extras that they had gathered up through the year. So I just thought that was a really nice way of kind of showing how those two communities definitely had some interactions in ways that we didn't necessarily know about early on. So I'm going to let Dianne talk about our next slide.
So our next section, we've divided the book into 5 chapters. And the second chapter is, as you can see on the slide, social and cultural happenings. And there were many going on here in St. George after the pioneers came down and settled the area. So the image on the right is 1890s of Frank Blake and Joseph Snow. It's most likely the performance of Rob Roy. And there was James Booth had a photography studio in town and ended up taking a lot of these pictures of the cultural happenings, the costumes and the plays and the reviews, things like that. The image on the left, we had so much fun with this image. It's college students, February of 1949. And you see the young man on the right painting a very nice very traditional landscape. And then you have the young lady on the left, which appears to be painting a expressionist vampire, we think. And if anybody knows anything about that painting or any information about it, we would really love to hear some stories about that picture. And then as we move on to the next slide, we've included an image from the college newspaper, and we felt this one was very pertinent. Kathleen and I finished writing this book during 2020. And this was published in the newspaper in January of 1919. And after the end of World War I, the Spanish influenza became a global pandemic. And it got especially bad as all the troops were returning home from World War I. And so Dixie Normal College, as it was called then, closed its doors in the middle of the semester in late October. And they did not reopen until the spring semester, January 6th. And when the students did come back, they were all wearing masks. It was required by law. And they tried to have a little bit of fun with it. They had a mask fashion show. So we thought that was very interesting. We know that the people that were sick were quarantined in their homes until 1920, and that a student, Jesse Hunt, and the college president, Erastus Snow Romney, died of pneumonia after the flu, which really gives a lot of weight to the quote that we chose, "Make the most of what remains."
So the next section we looked at was education, and we called the chapter actually Transforming from a One-Room Schoolhouse because one of the first things many of you have maybe heard this story, one of the first things the pioneers did when they came into the valley in late November of 1861 was to form a school. It was about a month later, so not the first thing, but pretty close. And they made it for their 103 students who were there. And then as soon as they get kind of established, they divided the community up into 4 wards based off of, LDS wards, and each ward has its own schoolhouse. But by 1900, their population, they just can't fit in those schools anymore. So in 1899, they start building the Woodward School, which is pictured on the left. And they did it basically for that more student space. And we actually really loved this image because, one, it's snow, and snow just, I don't know, is magical in St. George, right? But it also has, in parentheses, the old red prison, which I just thought was like some student being a little smart aleck, but I loved it. And then the image on the right is actually before the first Dixie Academy, or St. George Stake Academy, while it was being built, and it's finished in 1911. And it was created to help supplement the Woodward School, because Woodward carried grades 1 through 8. The St. George Stake Academy did high school for about the first 5 years until they started adding in some teacher education, which is where we would consider the college part of that evolution coming from. So it's been a lot of fun to learn a little bit more, especially about Dixie State and Woodward School, because, it's all about education, and we're educators at the end of the day. And then we also had to make sure we included some of the fun of education. So these are actually images from some Woodward School scrapbooks. And so I don't know, the playground, the fun that they're having, it really transforms. And I mean, honestly, I can't imagine any parent being okay with boxing gloves at recess anymore. But in the scrapbook, there was an account in 1932, about the same time as this, that jumping ropes and lasso ropes are in high favor with younger students in school just now. The popular playground activities change every few weeks, and with the coming of good weather, marbles are expected to be started again. So you kind of get a real good feel through these images, but also the words, kind of what you were expecting. So this, but Woodward School, actually by the middle of the Great Depression, had already overfilled as well. And so they built the St. George Elementary School. They also known as the Annex, which is kind of, you can barely see it in the picture on the right. That's the Annex. And it opened in 1936. And so grades 1 through 6 then continued in Woodward. And so they kind of just split between grades 1 through 6 and middle schools. So.
Well, and then we have the business of living. One of my favorite pictures with the turkey. I think it's one of those forgotten industries. A lot of people are very familiar with the fact that that there was crop growing happening down here, but not a lot of people are aware that this was hailed as the turkey production was the outstanding industry in Washington County in 1945. Turkey farming was successful for about 2 decades with hatcheries and farms and production plants, all of that. Another industry that we have pictured there is oil. Oil was found in 1907, and that was before there was a large market for oil. So several of these were drilled, but little oil was ever really produced. The ad that we have pictured in the book is something that we still kind of giggle about. It is a 1919 ad. And it says, if oil is struck, we all win. If it fails, we all lose. We hope we win. And so we thought that was the motivational quote of the century. This next one is an ad. So my grandfather always used to call more modern cure-alls, he'd call them, oh, that's snake oil. And I'm thinking it's because he probably remembered things, medicinals, such as the essence of life. So Johnson's Valley Tan Remedies was on the corner of Main Street and Diagonal. J.E. Johnson manufactured herbal medicinals, and it claimed to treat a very colorful array of maladies, from wind in the stomach to a toothache. It could be ingested or topically applied. And it was very questionable whether these remedies were going to cure or kill.
So the last section of our book is about how St. George transforms from a small town, because it was incredibly small for actually quite a while. But one of the reasons that I think, at least, that it really transforms has to do with the invention of the automobile and how that changes travel. The Arrowhead Trail Improvement and Development Association was a collective group with small towns that dotted the path from Los Angeles to Salt Lake. And today we think, of course, St. George is going to be on that map because I-15 goes through. But back in the early 1910s, that wasn't a certainty at all. And in fact, there was actually some people who advocated that we just bypass us. And so it was very important, and they advocated for it. There was one guy named Charles Bigelow who was very active. There was a lot of publishing in newspapers. They really played on the whole, we're close to Zion and it's a gateway to the wonderlands of the West kind of thing. So tourism definitely started really early, I think earlier than many of us think. And so when I say St. George was a small town, this is a picture that I think was probably from around 1912. We're estimating that off because it looks like telephone poles, and that's when I know they went up in St. George. So this is at the corner of Tabernacle and 100 West, and it's very interesting because that road, one of these roads doesn't exist anymore because it's now part of the park right at downtown by the Tabernacle. And the Woodward School is right there next to it, and it has a slow down sign because you're by a school, right? And in 1912, it looks like a tiny town because it was. There's about 1,737 people living in St. George in 1910. So compared to today's population, in 2020, the population was 94,535. I did some basic math and found out that this is over a 5,000% change in 110 years. So we're talking about some really remarkable growth over this century. And so for me, it's really hard sometimes to imagine, and I've noticed my students struggle with this. How do you imagine this completely different world? Especially if we're newcomers into this town and we're like, it's big. What do you expect, right? Maybe if your family's been here for a long time, you saw it as a smaller town, and so you've grown with it. But I think for those who are new, this is a way to visualize. And when we visualize, we kind of have a way to connect a little bit more to the history of an area. So that's what we have. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, but thank you so much for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that wonderful brief glimpse into the recent past the early past. I thought it would be more recent, but I'm glad you covered the breadth that you did. Now we're going to go back, maybe even a bit further back. I'm going to ask Loren to share one or two of the shorter, maybe much earlier accounts in his books, or whichever account he feels like sharing. Give us a real idea of what life was like here in years past. Go ahead, Loren.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and participate in the Southern Utah perspective. I kind of chose the Dixie Photo Studio story because I remember, Thomas Durant. He was like a legend in the community. He was one of the great photographers, had a great photo studio. That photo studio is still standing. You can drive down Tabernacle Street, still see the same neon sign there. Hasn't changed. It's kind of amazing that it's still there. So from 1955 to 1999, Thomas Porter Jack Durant left a photo legacy there. This included Dixie Roundup, Rodeo parade photos, passport photos, wedding photos, reunion photos, and photos of school children throughout the Washington County School District. So his address, of course, was 32 East Tabernacle. He had a shop for cameras, batteries, and flash bulbs. And so over that 41 years that he was operated the Dixie Photo Shop, he acquired a massive amount of photos and negatives. And I had the opportunity to go in with his son one time, Thomas Durant, and there was just thousands of photos and negatives in there. And I was just overwhelmed. It was just, it was kind of humbling to see all of those photos in there. So anyway, and he had Kodak cameras and Kodak film. And so I guess, and he was kind of, he's kind of interesting. So, I mentioned here, Thomas Porter, then this is talking about from his, quoting his son, Tom Durant. Thomas Porter also didn't believe his country owed him anything. And when he died, he had thousands of dollars in uncashed Social Security checks. It's just interesting. So he's born up in Idaho, and he, he's raised in, he's raised in Vancouver, Canada. He joins the LDS Church, and in his 30s, he's living in Colorado. Anyway, and so eventually, his parents were moved to that area, and then he of course was raised in Idaho, Salt Lake City, and Vernon, Utah. And he, as a child, he was given a camera by his mother, who was a photographer, and that's what got him started in the photography. So he becomes a professional photographer. He's doing a circuit of taking pictures of school children in the Salt Lake City area, in Nevada, and into Canada. And so this is, he's doing this traveling circuit, and that's when he met his wife, Marilyn Jane Miner, in Alberta, Canada. And she was a recent convert to the LDS Church, and so they married in the, this is kind of interesting, they married on the steps of the Cardston, Alberta Temple, and then a year later they returned and they were sealed in the Cardston, Alberta Temple. And they moved then to Bingham Canyon, where he opened a Fox photography shop. And they began raising their 3 children, Grace, Tom, and Myron Durant. And then in November 1955, he moved his family to St. George. He bought out a Mr. Rollins, who owned the Dixie Photo Shop. And that at the time was operating on the main floor of the 3-story Arrowhead Hotel, which was near the corner of Tabernacle and Main Street. So those of you who remember the Liberty Hotel, it was quite the interesting place. So in 1964, he moved to his present location of 32 East Tabernacle, and then of course the neon sign depicts that. When he would get people in front of the camera, he would always say, "Smile at the birdie," and I remember him saying that as a kid. So it's just, and his favorite thing would of course he would say cheese as you're smiling. He'd say he'd say cheese. So anyway, he always took two pictures of each child to give them a choice of pictures to pick from. And Tom Durant remembers his father. He says, "I remember Dad always make up nicknames for the people he was photographing, since he didn't know their name and had to instruct them how to pose." And this is also according to his youngest daughter, Deborah Judd. He says their nickname usually made them smile. And so I wanted to read just a couple of other quotes that Deborah Judd remembers of her, that her father was 55 years old when she was born. Interestingly enough, on her birth certificate, it states that her father's profession was a builder. Despite her father's advanced age, when she was born, Deborah said she became very close to her father. "He never once let me think I was an unwelcome surprise," she said. "I loved taking my father to the doctor's office because he would always abbreviate the health forms." She said, adding, "He said, they don't need to know all that stuff. Besides, we're paying cash." She also said that he had a very extreme work ethic. That work ethic also rubbed off on his children because Deborah said her father was always having them work on something, whether it was pounding nails or shoveling coal into a boiler. Thomas Porter Durant was very frugal. So anyway, and he goes on to talk about how his father never owed anybody a dime because he never borrowed money from anyone. He drove the last car that he owned for 30 years. It was a 1968 model. So he was a very private man. He never sought the limelight for any services that he rendered. On his 90th birthday, Deborah placed a news item in the newspaper inviting patrons of Dixie Photo Shop to come and visit her father at his business. And when her father found out about it, he wasn't very happy about that. He just didn't always tell everything he knew about himself, adds Deborah, but he was always true to himself. I think it was more that he didn't like to tell more than was necessary, and he never, ever dwelt on the past. He only lived in the day. He was eternally optimistic. He never complained about his health. Every day above ground is a good day, he would say. He refused to talk about his death. I think it was just like him to be reticent and mysterious. It made us listen closer. Don't we all wish we were that way now? There's just too much information on all of us out there. Thomas Porter Grant also liked telling tall tales, Deborah Judd said. Dad liked to stretch a story, so if you heard it 3 or 4 times, it was probably true, she said. Dad used to tell stories about his travels that were just unbelievable. I remember the one about how he had driven his car clear to the North Pole and had met Santa. Really now, I ask you. Recently, I came upon a Christmas card taken of Dad in the 30s with his old car parked by a vista of what looks to be a glacier. Sure enough, it was Alaska. So I just thought that was kind of fun. And I really enjoyed when Kathleen and Dianne were showing the picture of the Woodward building, because I had some great memories there. You know, I had classes on the main floor. I took a science class from Fred Page in 7th grade, and then in 9th grade, I had Jack Hepler across the hall to the south. Upstairs, I had Daryl Hafen and Heber Jones, and I'd always check out a library book from Bessie Snow. And then across the street, I'd go to the Annex building. I had English classes from Lavera Pelt and Miss Nagley, and from Stan Smoots. And then I took an industrial arts class from Mr. Isom, and PE was in the gym on 100 West. It wasn't the same gym that was on the Main Street, and that was from Coach Blake. So, and then I had classes. I had classes in the Dixie Academy building, and they weren't using some of the buildings at that time that I was in Woodward. So that was from 7th, 8th, and 9th grades at the time I attended. And so, you know, I took a pre-algebra class from Mr. Johnson, an English class from Mrs. Buller, Laura Buller, in the basement of the Dixie Academy building. And then Grant Hafen, I had a math class from him upstairs on the 2nd floor. So good memories of the old campus, Kathleen and Dianne.
Well, thanks for sharing those accounts. So you said his daughter Deborah, did she marry?
Deborah Judd.
She
Deborah
married Judd?
Yes.
Okay, so and that's the building we're in now, is the Judd Bungalow. Did she grow up in that house?
I don't know. Couldn't tell you.
Okay.
I know you're wanting information about the
do.
Judd Bungalow.
Okay,
I couldn't find anyone previous to, I think it was Thomas. Just like you already, yeah, what you already knew.
Judd Jr., right?
Thomas Judd, yeah, Thomas Judd Jr.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm curious. First of all, are you the only one? Dianne and Kathleen, were you born here in St. George, or did you move here?
So I am not from St. George, but I am a native Utahn. My family actually comes back several generations. I have pioneers and all of that, but we hail more from the Ogden and St. George, or Ogden and Logan area. So other end of the state. But my parents were actually history majors, and so I actually grew up learning all of state history.
And how old were you when you first visited St. George?
I honestly couldn't tell you, but I can tell you for certain that I moved here about 5 years ago.
Okay, all right. How about you, Diane?
I was not born here. I've been here for almost 14 years now. Honestly, I was very taken with it when I came to visit. My parents retired here. And, you know, I came to visit a few times and then I decided that I wanted to move here. So I was fortunate enough to, at that time to be able to get a job here at Dixie State. And so I have been here the whole time that I have lived here. So it's been a really interesting decade and a half.
A lot of change.
So much. Just from my perspective, I don't have the memories, obviously, that Loren does. But when I came here, it was much smaller than what I had been used to. And I could not believe how rapidly, once the development started, it was so fast. Even the university, it had just become a four-year college a couple years before I started. And I have now seen it go from a college to a university to granting master's degrees to now developing doctorate degrees.
What is
in 14 years? That's
was it the impetus of the college that got the development going, or what do you attribute to? When did the building boom kind of begin?
Can I comment for just a minute?
Sure.
Because I think the Dixie Red Hills Golf Course in 1965 was really the impetus to getting modern St. George started. It's literally, if you build it, they will come. It was a vision that Orville Hafen had. And once that was started, then it really started opening things up. The other thing that was really significant was December 14th, 1973, when Interstate 15 opened up. That was just major because all of a sudden it literally Americanized St. George and Washington County. It opened it up to all of these, 1,470 miles of Interstate 15 from California all the way up to Montana. And it was really a great thing that happened. And I remember them building it while I was trying to get to the dairy because they were building the freeway that was blocking my original access to our dairy operation. But I was going to just tell you also, TerraCore was another major project. In 1968, TerraCore developed Bloomington and Bloomington Hills. It's later annexed into the city. But you also just have to say that Zion National Park is still, it's almost like the #1 draw to Washington County. I remember Heber Jones telling me when there used to be a visitor center that was just north of the port of entry. The building's gone, but Heber said the two major questions that people asked when they stopped in there was, where's the restroom and how do you get to Zion National Park? So it's definitely brought tourists from all over the world to this beautiful Red Rock color country area, and then of course the warm weather, and then Dixie when Dixie Pioneer Memorial Hospital expanded into Dixie Medical Center on 400 East in 1975. That was really a precursor to our area becoming a regional center for hospital and medical care. Mm-hmm. And then you just can't ignore Dixie College, the impact that Dixie College has had, particularly beginning from the 1980s onward, like Dianne said. That's from my perspective.
Kathleen, you mentioned that what was the earliest name of Dixie College?
In 1911, it was known as the St. George Stake Academy, and it changed its name in about depends what official document you want to go with, but the 1917 to 1918 school year, it changed its name to Dixie Academy.
Dixie Academy. Then the next step was
The Dixie Normal College.
Dixie
then-
Normal College.
Yes, we've had about 6 or 7 names already over the years.
Wow. Okay. Well, I have to say before I go on with some more questions, as a bookseller, I keep getting people come in, and half of our clientele are tourists. You know, half of our customers are tourists, and they want books on the history of this area. You know, of course, like all of us, they're struck by the beauty of the red rocks and everything, and they want to know, you know, what's the past of this town. And there haven't been that many books. Doug Alders, or I'm trying to get a hold of Lyman Hafen so I can get more of his books back in. But I'm so glad for the addition of these 2 books. How did you come up with the idea behind your photo compilation, you and Dianne?
So one of my goals with special collections and archives is being more involved in our community, because I think we have just this giant treasure trove of such amazing preservation of history of this area that hasn't really been well known. And so I was kind of looking for a way, how do I make these images more accessible to the regular community, and not just people who live here, but also those who are coming through. And so when I saw the Images of America, I was like, you know what, this is maybe that perfect route. I get to share just a small selection of those images and make them maybe fall a little bit in love with St. George like I have.
Yeah, cool. So you reached out to Arcadia, or did they contact you?
They actually tend to look for local authors just to write on the areas.
Mhm.
So it was kind of a mutual, hey,
Well,
we both would like to do this. So
that's good. Okay. And what percentage of the special collections and archives would you say this book represents?
a very small amount. There's only 179 images in this collection. And I would say our photos alone probably number in the tens of thousands, if not close to 100,000 images.
Wow.
Easily. I just had a student who processed a collection, and she probably had over 1,000 just negatives that she sleeved easily.
Can anyone come in to see those?
Absolutely, and please do, actually. Like, yes, that would make my day. So right now we're open between 10 to noon. We break for lunch because we're fairly small staff, and then we're open again 1 to 5, Monday through Fridays. But if you can't make it because you work, we are happy to take special appointments. Just kind of give us a heads up that really you can't make it those times, and we'll have you in. Lauren has definitely come in and done some research with us as well. So yes, please. We are free, we're open. I don't care where you're from.
Okay, that's good to know. Were there any particular photos you wanted to include but couldn't because of limited space? And yeah, some of your favorites that you wanted to include and couldn't, and then maybe Dianne can talk about some of those.
So this was really hard because we knew we were limited. We could only have, it was a very small range that we had to get. And we were trying to tell a story with it. So there's one image that I just think is one of the most beautiful pictures of St. George. It's taken, I think it's actually one of Juanita Brooks's pictures. And I personally just adore her. I think she's amazing. But it's a picture from where her house is close to the top of Main Street, where it's up on the hill. And she's looking down at Main Street. And it's got this lovely branching off to the side with trees. And it's a very beautiful image. It's just, when I came to the decision, do I want to talk about Juanita Brooks with her picture or her house and the view from her house? I had to decide her face was actually more important in her story. So that was one for me. What do you think, Dianne?
Well, I am more than a little bit fascinated with Maureen Whipple. And I know that she, during her lifetime, caused quite a ruckus over her book that she wrote, but
also, wait, not everybody here may be familiar, and I'm not. Marlene Whipple, what was the book?
The
Giant Joshua.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
Anyway, we have a number of photos of her that are very well done, of her sitting up on the Sugarloaf, up on the Dixie Rock. And we had to choose just one. And there were a number, and she sort of embodied the landscape. It was the look on her face and the way that she is kind of taking in the surroundings. The photo captured that really well. And I wished that we could have added another one or two of some of her photo collection.
And what years was she living? Late
Yeah,
1800s, early 1900s?
She's fairly contemporary with Brooks. Her book came out, I believe, in 41.
On the 40s, okay.
And I want to say she lived somewhere to the late 70s or 80s.
Okay.
the photos that we have, I think, look to be around, I don't know, 40s, 50s.
Okay.
Is that what you would estimate, Kathleen?
Yeah, it would be.
And as you've looked through their book, Loren, I know you told me a lot of things. Did any pictures in particular stand out to you? And if so, why?
Yeah,
I know we caught one mistake.
Oh, no, not there. I love their transforming from one room schoolhouse. I just thought that it brought out in vivid detail what life was like on the old Dixie College campus. You know, of course, it had all been pretty much, it had moved by the time I went to school. But I just, you know, there's some things that I just really have great memories. I mentioned, of course, the Woodward building, and but I also love the Carnegie Library. It was one of my favorite buildings, and I was so sad to see that building demolished. I always felt like the Carnegie Library was located between the Woodward building and the LDS Tabernacle.
Oh.
So it's where the parking lot is now, behind the Tabernacle. And there's also the recreation hall that was built there. The recreation hall was kind of an interesting place. I mean, that's where they had dances, and I finally remember that. And those were two buildings that I had fun with. And then, you know, because the Carnegie Library, one thing that was really interesting. So you'd walk in, you'd walk up the wooden steps, and they always creaked. And, you know, you always had to be absolutely quiet when you went into the library, okay? And then they had a great children's library in the basement. And I don't know, I really miss that. I wish that they could have kept, the city could have kept that building and restored it and made it for another use.
Okay. Well, you've already told us about your memories growing up. Let's see, how much, what's been the biggest change downtown over the years?
I'm gonna start by just kind of giving Dianne and Kathleen just a little bit of perspective about when I was growing up about St. George. So St. George essentially ended at 700 South, if you can believe that. Okay, so when I was a kid growing up, you know, once you left 700 South, you were pretty much out of the town, and everything else was just farms and dairy farms.
Was that where the old racetrack was? Rodeo grounds. I'm sorry, rodeo grounds.
Okay, so the rodeo grounds were well, there are posse grounds that were behind the Starlight Theater, which is north of Sunset Boulevard, and
Right.
okay, and then of course you have the parade grounds, which we still have. The city kept that. So let's see, and then of course the Dixie Roundup Rodeo is what I remember, and of course it's still there. But yeah, I remember, you know, one of the things that I kind of hate to have, I wish that the city would not have torn down the Erastus Snow, what they called the Big House. I never got to see it in my lifetime. And I heard so many stories about this building. You know, it was right on the corner of Main and St. George Boulevard, from what I was told. it was, and Erastus Snow being, pretty much the leader, the main leader of Southern Utah during this time period of the pioneer period. It was just, I don't know, really kind of sad to see that building torn down. But there's a lot of, you asked about the changes. So I'm really, I know that there's always change, and there's a lot of things that have changed with the downtown. The good thing about it, of course, is that, the LDS Tabernacle, the Dixie Academy building, Judd's store, the Opera House, the Social Hall, the St. George Museum, the Pioneer Courthouse, all of those buildings, thank goodness, have been retained. They're still part of the downtown, atmosphere and structure. So, but I worry a little bit about some of the high-rise, apartment complexes that have gone downtown. I was talking with one of the owners, the co-owner of one of the bed and breakfasts downtown, adjacent to the Brigham Young Winter Home, and she had purchased property there on 100 South, and and then unbeknownst to her, and without I guess what would I say? I guess adequate notice, they the developers put up a pretty much, what was it, I guess a 5-story apartment building there, and so it blocked their view of Pine Valley and the Red Hills. So you never know. You hope that what they're planning, particularly downtown with the Trafalgar and the Travel Lodge building. So the city has bought that property, and I'm hopeful that something like maybe Harmon's neighborhood market could go in there, something that would revitalize the downtown and really make people want to come down there.
Okay. Let's see. This is, I'm being selfish here, but as a bookseller, I would love to know how many different independent bookstores you can recall there ever being here in St. George. Because when we moved here in 2014, there hadn't been one for about 5 years, not counting, there was a used bookstore that was.
The bookseller?
Yeah. But wasn't there a Little Professor at some point?
There was.
Were there any other, really early, in all your pictures that you looked through, were there any bookstores? No. Huh. Okay.
Well, I was going to say there was the R&K bookstore, and that was in the city center next to the Dixie Bowl. And then Dianne mentioned the bookseller, and that was just on approximately 33 East St. George Boulevard. And Ronnie Sakala ran that store for a long time, and it was just a wonderful bookstore.
I loved it.
Yeah, and I
when did
just
that
really
close?
sometime in the early or mid 1990s. And you mentioned Little Professor Books. There was also Shiloh Books, which was a Christian bookstore, which was out on Sunset Boulevard. And don't forget Doc's Book Loft. That was down on 295 South Main. And then, of course, there was the Book Stop at 15 North and 700 East and the Camp Corner Shopping Center. I remember that one.
Okay.
I was thinking of the one that was right there, a couple doors down from Urban Renewal. And it was while I was living here. So it had to have been 2007 or after.
Oh.
But it was, I think, used only.
Okay. Okay.
Well, I remember Little Professor Bookstore was there in that somewhere in that location, and then they moved down to down on Main Street.
Yeah.
And then eventually closed.
Okay, now as a relative outsider, and definitely an outsider, I always hear about the founding families of St. George. I'm not quite sure. I know there's the Hamlins, the Hafens, the Sigmillers, but just which families are considered founding families? I mean, because from my understanding of church history, Brigham Young sent 309, was it 309 individual saints or 309 families down here?
It was families.
Families. So
Yes.
which of those, I mean, did they all stick it out? Were they all founding families? Or who are considered the big, I get the feeling that there is a hierarchy of the important families of the city or town. I don't know if you even want to address this, but who are some of the families? What are the names?
Well, George Jarvis, was one of those families, and and I come through that line, and my family was never really prominent as far as early on. My grandmother, my grandfather were really struggled. In fact, they had a home that's now where, well, it's where the Spectrum building used to be. That's where my father grew up. And so, yes, there was, I guess one of the prominent persons I would have to say would be Israel Ivins and Anthony Ivins. So Israel Ivins was the first physician. His building is still standing over on 100 West. And his son, Anthony W. Ivins, I would think was probably one of the premier founding fathers. He did so much for this area. He lived here for 32 years. He was involved in every aspect of city and county government and ecclesiastical positions. He helped to establish the Shivlet Indian Reservation. He just did. He served several missions for the church down in Mexico.
And I take it Ivins was named after him?
Ivins, the town of Ivins was named after him. So, yeah, I think Anthony W. Ivins was really a major player.
Okay. Any others you can think of, or you just don't like it? Okay, I'm just going to back off that. Are any?
Tanya?
Yes.
In Washington, which happened before St. George, I understand, in the city of Washington, that Mr. Covington was the first bishop here. And his name was Robert Dockery Covington. And if you travel on Telegraph Street to the museum at the corner of Main and Telegraph, you'll see statues in front of the Washington Museum, and his statue is the one closest to the post office. And there's been, and your hesitation is understandable, because there have been some stories about his having had slaves in his family where he moved from, and then he converted and moved here. But he was a direct relative of my erstwhile next door neighbor. So I happen to know about that family, and that's the historic house. The Covington House is the historic house here in Washington. Okay. That's been preserved, and two nice ladies give tours. Well, if you're curious.
Thanks for sharing that. Is Santa Clara, who were the families in Santa Clara?
Well, I think, and I mentioned this in my book, Jacob Tobler and Heinrich Hug, and their story is explored by Douglas Tobler, who is a BYU history professor, and he talks about how Jacob Tobler and Jacob Tobler eventually, or he remained loyal to the church. Heinrich Hug eventually left the church and moved to Oregon, but both of them helped to establish, Santa Clara. And of course there were, Hafens and Stukeys and others there, and Whitwers. But yeah, I'm just mentioning two, and there were a lot of others.
Okay. I'm also interested, because Santa Clara was established first, wasn't it?
Santa Clara was established in 1854. The first community in the county was Harmony. So Harmony is essentially known as the mother community of Washington County.
Okay. maybe I'm wrong. I'm assuming that because Brigham Young chose the site in St. George to build the temple, that kind of gave St. George the oomph that the other smaller communities did not get. I don't know. But I wondered how the residents of those other areas felt about that, it not being in Santa Clara or in Washington. But, well, of course, now that's going to be, anyway. Any insight on that?
So I can kind of give some insight to this. So St. George was not the first town. And actually in our introduction, we go through all the towns in St. George that were settled first, right? Loren was actually absolutely right with, it was Harmony, but we also have Santa Clara in 1854, Hamblin and Pinto in 1858, Grafton, Harrisburg, and Pine Valley in 59, and Adventure, which doesn't exist anymore, in 1860. So there's a lot of towns already kind of settled before the Mormon pioneers were called in 1861 to St. George. I think part of the reason that St. George got the temple was less because it wasn't so much a competition, so much as the other towns were all very small. Santa Clara was originally established as a missionary to the Native Americans on the Santa Clara River post, same as Harmony. And so Washington was kind of formed as an experiment. Could cotton be grown in southern Utah? And when they found out that it could, that's when Brigham sends down a big batch, the 300 plus families. So it's actually the biggest community. And so I think that's why it becomes more central. At least that's what I think. What do you think, Loren?
Yes, I agree. But there's one thing that I thought was kind of interesting too, is that when Silver Reef came into the area, Silver Reef, here comes this mining community of Catholics and Protestants, and also a number of Chinese immigrants, okay, who helped do the mining there. And so Silver Reef is getting to be a pretty good sized city in the 1880s, late 1870s and early 1880s. And so that alarmed members of the People's Party, which you could read that into that as the Mormon Party. And so they went to the Utah Territorial Legislature and they moved the county line eastward in 1882. And this maintained the People's Party majority in Washington County by transferring such Mormon farming communities as Grafton, Rockville, and Springdale from Kane County to Washington County. I just thought that was kind of interesting.
Ah, okay. Do any of you, I was fascinated by that picture, that early picture that showed the Woodward building, and you said it was the intersection of Tabernacle and 100 West. And there was that small home across the street. Was that the original Judd's store? Or what was that?
I think Judd's store would have been across the street and not in the picture.
Okay, but what was that home? Because it looked like the Woodward building was on the south side. Was that Tabernacle going right down the middle? The way it's facing, it would have to be, I would think. And then there's this home over here. I couldn't, anyway, my curiosity is, you don't know of anything that existed where the Judd bungalow was built before then.
I don't know it existed, but in our book on the first page, right next to the title page, we have an old plat map. And I looked at it and I was able to kind of pinpoint where the bungalow is now. And we found out that at least at one point early on, it was owned by a R and Joseph Berkeley. I don't know who they are, but I can give you that at least.
Okay, okay. Thank you. Well, at what point do you believe, I already asked that. Okay, so we're close, we're a little bit over. So finally, do any of you have plans to follow up with other books along this same line or otherwise? Loren, are you going to write your own personal history?
Well, I'm kind of working on my life history, but that's just for my family. So
well, why? You've got all these rich stories.
So,
Think about it.
no, I don't know. I've been thinking about the possibility of doing a sequel to, to this book, but I have some other possibilities of maybe some possible biographies, and maybe an industry book about a particular industry in this county. So
The
that's
dairy
really,
industry?
I've already done that because that was my
Okay.
first book,
Okay.
Milking Time, which was the history of dairy farming in Washington County. That was published in 2010. So, no, it'd be another industry.
Okay. You're keeping it close to the vest. Okay.
Yeah.
Kathleen, how about you?
So I don't know about any books for certain, but everything I do is about preserving that history. I'm certain at some point I will have some articles come out, and I do a lot of presentations. So I'm definitely going to keep my finger in this pie for certain.
Okay. Dianne?
Well, for me, this project was out of curiosity and excitement, and it was fun. I'm public services in the library for work, but going through archival photographs and trying to figure out how we can share them with the population, that to me is fun. So I hope that we could do something where we can continue to share what we have in our collection with the greater community here in St. George, and with the tourism that comes through, so people learn about what this place really is about, right?
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening to talk about your new books and the history of this beautiful area.
Thank you for having us.
You're
Thank
welcome.
you. Thank you.
Remember,
Tom.
you can buy both these books in our store. Thank you, Barbara. And you can order the Images of America St. George through our website as well. I will follow up with an email that includes the link to the recording of this for those of you who were a little bit late. And you can feel free to share that with anyone.
Tanya, would it be
yes.
okay if I just want to add that we set it up so that all of the royalties from the Images of America book on St. George are being donated back to the Dixie State Library, so that we can continue to conserve and hopefully digitize some things to get them out for the community to be able to
That's
see.
wonderful.
That's amazing.
That's wonderful. I wish I'd known that. I'll have to make a little sign about that on your signing table tomorrow. Send me an email with the exact verbiage on where all those were. Yeah.
I will.
Okay. So once again, thanks, panelists, and to all of you who joined us this evening. Don't forget to show your support and stop in at the bookstore tomorrow, and you can ask your questions of the panelists then if you have any, and you can get signed copies of your book. So good evening and stay well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it.